Mr. Scott Allen Roberts is joining us right now. Now, Scott Allen Roberts is a designer, illustrator, and writer of fiction and nonfiction. Two of my favorite topics in books, fiction and nonfiction. Scott Allen Roberts has not been on a show with me in years, man, and it just bugs me because he's a great guest and love having this man on the show. Scott Allen Roberts, welcome to Skywatchers Radio, my friend. How are you doing tonight?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing a lot better now that you're here, sir.
Well, thank you.
You know, we were reminiscing here, before the show started during the break, about the last time we had you on one of my shows, and man, the time flies, doesn't it? 2011, 12, around there. That's when we last spoke on a radio show. It's
crazy. As I was saying to you, I start looking through things and a bunch of the things I've been doing over the last few years, and you look at something and you go, oh, I got to get to that, or when did that? That was just the other day or the other week, and then you realize, it was 4 years ago. Oh, man. Sometimes the time goes so fast that you don't realize that how fast it's gone by.
I remember being a kid and just sitting there and being like, man, in the year 2000, I'm going to be in my 20s. It's going to be so cool. And now I'm at my late 30s, and it's 2015. I'm like, Jesus, this is not good.
Oh, next birthday, I'm getting you a walker.
I already had one of those after my car accident in 2009, but thank you very much for bringing back those dark memories, other guy.
I got to tell you, I grew up as a product of the late 60s and the early to mid 70s, graduated high school in 78, that same year as, if you remember that 70s show when that was on?
Yes.
That was the year I graduated high school. And so I'm 54 years old now, and I remember growing up on black and white TV. We had a 13-inch black and white TV set and 4 channels. And that was it. There was no cable TV. There was no cable. There was no cell phones. No, we had a rotary phone for part of the time that I was growing up. And now it's amazing to me. I'm not elderly by any means.
So long ago.
We just had we had another baby. I've got a baby that's now 11 weeks old. I mean, I'm still young enough to be having kids. What the hell happened to me there?
No, but people like you and Art Bell are heroes to me for this, and for many other reasons, by the way. But the fact that you're having kids at an older age, it tells me that, hey, there's still time for me to have kids, because I haven't had any kids. Of course, I haven't really wanted to have any kids, so I've stayed away from that situation, from rising up, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
I've purposely avoided, long-term relationships because I don't want to have family or kids right now, for other reasons, many different personal reasons. But maybe when I'm in my 50s or something like that, I might consider having kids. And that's a great age, I think, to have kids also because, yeah, you're getting older, but I think you get to enjoy kids a little bit more, especially when you're retired. You can go and hang out with them playing baseball and whatnot. There's a little bit of a different life, I think, that you experience as a father when you're a little bit older than if you were a lot younger, and you really can't enjoy your kids because you're working all the time.
Well, I can tell you what, I can sum it up in you almost don't want to cite Bill Cosby's comedy anymore these days. But I remember...
Especially not if it involves pudding pop.
That's right. Yeah. When I was a younger man, I remember he was talking about parenthood, and one of his bits was, he says, when you are a parent, he starts out like that, he said, you are no longer, and you have children, you no longer are concerned with justice. You're concerned with what makes quiet. And he's very right on that. Yeah. For me, all I can tell you is being a dad at age 54, and my wife's about 20 years younger than I am, so she's still, in her prime of having kids. I have 6 kids now altogether. I've got older ones from a previous marriage, and I got my 3 with my wife now. And we just had now, we've got the 11-week-old. And
how much sleep are you actually getting?
What was that word?
How much sleep are you actually getting?
Sleep. I've heard of that word.
It's a foreign word. Yeah, it's a foreign word.
It's a foreign word, but
it's a 4-letter word, sleep.
What's interesting is when we found out, I thought she was going to be able to start coming on all these trips with me and doing this stuff because we've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and my 14-year-old lives with it from my previous marriage. And so we had the 3-year-old, who at the time was 2 last year, and I'm thinking, Raini, you can start traveling with me. You can start coming to Egypt. You can start doing these trips with us and going places and doing more stuff. And lo and behold, I was gone in Egypt for a month, and I came back last March, and not a week later, she puts a pregnancy strip in front of my face and says, "What does that look like to you?" And I said, "You mean that big blue plus sign?" And I literally sat with my face in my hand for about a day and a half going, I can't believe this is happening. How did this happen? You know, the typical guy line, how did you let this happen?
I'm sorry, if you don't know how it happened, there's a problem.
Well, I think I figured it out.
You figured it out at this point, yeah, I would say.
So
you had what you dropped off a little.
That's what it was. It was the Nephilim. That's what it was.
There it is. It was. She could have used that. She said, "Well, a watcher descended and said, 'Lo.'" No, but it didn't happen that way. So now I've got it figured out, and we fixed the problem. So that's good. That shouldn't be happening again.
Ouch.
So, and it wasn't all that bad. I actually had it done, and I went out and raked leaves for about an hour, and afterwards I went,
how much did you cry while you were raking the leaves?
I said, I think I should go lay down. So,
I had my dog fixed, not to cut you off, but I had my dog fixed a few years ago, and that was the saddest ride back home, not to the hospital. He was happy on the way there because he didn't know what was going on. He was like, "Oh man, this is exciting. We're out of the road and we're not in the house. I'm in the car and jonesing, and woof, woof." He was happy as it could be. But the ride home, Scott, let me tell you, the faces he made at me were more like, "You traitor, you bastard, you backstabber, what have you done to me? I hate your guts.
I'm going to kill you when you're in the middle of sleeping," kind of.
Yes. Instantly, I found urine all over my shoes. He was biting on my shoes. I mean, this dog had it out for me for months.
Did he get one of those collars, too?
He did.
All right.
He did. It wasn't a pleasant time. It was not pleasant at all.
Oh, yeah, I feel bad. What was the old Far Side cartoon where it shows the woman pulling out of her driveway in her car and the little dog's talking out the window to the neighbor dog? And he's saying like, "Ha, ha, 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 I'm going for a ride, and after that she's going to take me to get tutored." So,
yeah.
So there you go.
Neutered. Now, last time we talked, of course, you had the book, the Nephilim book.
Yes.
And that was, I still have that book, and I've gone through it like 3 times, by the way. Great book.
Oh,
really, really good read. But, what have you done since that book? Have you written anything else that you might want to share with the audience here?
I have. Let's see. I did a follow-up to that book. That book came. First was of course, the Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, and that came out February of 2012. And then the next year, I came out with The Secret History of the Reptilians, and it was subtitled "The Pervasive Presence of the Serpent Throughout Human History, Religion, and Alien Mythos." And so it wasn't a big book about. And now let's identify the reptilian race here on the planet. I got into some of that, and as I was writing it, my head really went away from. I was really struggling with it. It was a dog of a book for me. It was not a topic I enjoyed all that much, but one my publisher asked me about, and so I wanted to keep trying to research this out. And the more I kept running into the stuff about the reptilians, I kept running into the same stories over and over again. And yet nobody seemed to have any kind of source material. And I did when I was actually writing one chapter, I paused. I wrote in the book. I said, I'm going to go to my computer now and put in a word search. And I put in, reptilian aliens. And I came back with like 1.6 million references. And I said, and I typed in the book, I said, we got all these references. And I took the top 10 and I listed what they were all saying, just in mini paragraph form. And almost all of those top 10 sites had the same story being told by a different person with only slightly different verbiage in places, but they were quoting the same story. They all plagiarized it from somewhere. I think only God knows where the original story came from. And I said, it's interesting to me that all these accounts are out there, but there's no source material. And I started getting a little disillusioned with trying to find source material. So I said, what I think I'm starting to see here is more of a psychological need on people's parts to believe in this kind of stuff. And I went to great pains to say in the book, I don't dismiss the possibility that the reptilian race exists. And there are some people who are very good at writing about this stuff. I said, for me, let's focus on the mythology. Where did it come from? Why is it here? What are the ancient mythologies? And let's talk about that. And then let's talk about why people need this in their lives. And I really looked at it as there's almost a religion building around it, even though, you can't say, I go to the Church of Reptile. It's not anything like that. It's not in that
Right.
orthodox sense that we want to put it together.
Well,
But
hold on.
Yeah.
They do have the Church of Set, as,
I'm
the
sure.
snake-
Yeah.
snake
Right, the
from
Egyptian
Egypt,
Set. Right. Set, versus, Horus.
Right.
Right.
And
But-
there's still cults, and there are still.
But was
organizations
Set
that worship
looked at?
that.
Hold on, but was Set looked upon as a reptilian? Because I don't remember if he was.
Yes, it was.
He was, and the approach
Okay.
I was taking with all those, and what I mean by establishing religion is not so much that there weren't, and I covered, there are a lot of ancient religions that
Right.
almost every ancient culture, every ancient religion had some kind of serpentine aspect to it.
Right.
In one form or another, either directly face on or, in a sideways angle. You could look at, obviously in
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve, the serpent in the garden, and so
Right.
on. And but then you've got like Krishna, who dispensed the forbidden knowledge of the gods from underneath the banyan tree while sitting on a coiled serpent. You've got Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of the Mayans. You've got all these different references. Look at the Chinese dragon. Was a reference, without that being a religion built around the dragon. That was just part of their spirituality. And you have the Chinese dragon that was the bringer of fertility and happiness. Whereas in like Christianity and Judaism, that serpent character was the representation of evil and the fall. And then you've got the Gnostics who might tell you, well, no, he wasn't all that bad. We've got the story mixed up. And so these were some interesting things I started studying in that book. And I really, really kind of concluded the book. I'll tell you this. I had some people write reviews on the book that were very hostile and very unhappy with me. This is not the book I bought. It's a waste of paper. It's because, it didn't talk about, he didn't even say where the reptilians came from. And I said, why?
Well,
do
if
I
you had
know
the
that?
answers to that, you'd be sitting on gold right now.
Yeah, nothing new about this book. And the way I approach and I justify the way I wrote it is to say I took that different angle. I wanted to explore why we need this, not whether or not it's true. There's a lot of people out there that write about that. I wanted to find out why we need it so badly. Why, if it's not at our fingertips, why do we go looking for something? So what's the draw and what's the need? And I was equating our current day mythos about reptilians to our ancient mythological stories, tales of the serpent interacting with humans. And so it was an interesting foray for me. When I was done with that book, I was like, whew. It was one of those that when you write a book, it's more about, I say it's saying I wrote a book is a whole hell of a lot more fun than saying I'm in the middle of writing a book.
Right.
And it's so much more daunting. It's being done it's like, wow, whew, I am done. All you do until you get the book deal is go, man, I want to write a book. I want to write a book. I want to write a book. And then when you get the book deal, you're like, yeah, I got to sit down and write this. And, it's not that I hadn't thought about these things for many years and written down many things, but
That sounds like me when I'm going to read a book, when I'm going to go buy it. I'm like, I'm going to buy the book. It's going to be a great book. Then I get the book and it's really, really big. And I'm
dude.
like, I got to read all that. Oh, man.
yeah. It was kind of like, I won't even go there. Well, this led into then the next book that I did came out late 2013. And I wrote this with a good friend of mine, Dr. John Ward, who's a British archaeologist, lives and works in Luxor, Egypt. And he and his wife have the big site of Gebel El Silsila. There, as a matter of fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be flying over there just to spend some time over working with them on their site. And it's a big quarry site, sandstone quarries, and it really dates back from the Greco-Roman times all the way back through the dynastic periods in Egypt into the Paleolithic times, where you've got, we were sitting out there finding on this site, and the site's about 20 miles square, and we're hiking all over it, and you're right on the Nile, and when you're on the west bank of the Nile of this quarry site, you just start walking west, you're in the desert. And so the Sahara is right there. And so we're out just combing this site and going up and down. We're finding old rock art and flint knappings with a broken flint weapon sitting right there on a hilltop, a rocky, dusty, sandy hilltop. That's been there for probably 17,000 years. And sitting on a
totally uncovered, just sitting there.
Just sitting there, because there's nothing to cover it up. The sands will blow in. I'm sure there were times where they were covered with sand, but then they blow off. It rains. You get sandstorms. It's right on the Nile, but it's on this hill, and it feels when you got to the top of this particular section of their site where you're on like cobblestones is what it felt like. It looked like it was all flattened, curved, flattened, topped cobblestones. But you're walking, and it's all, and you'd approach like little circles about 8 feet in diameter of raised stone, where this is where they would put probably sticks in the ground and a skin over the top or some kind of covering over that. And they had these little huts, and there were these little villages like this all over these rock tops. And you'd find the flint knappings and old tools and things. It's just places people don't go. You're out in the middle of godforsaken nowhere. And so it was very exciting. And they've had some very exciting finds over there. So I'm going to be going over in a couple of weeks, mid-March, to join them for a couple of weeks over there.
That's a whole book in itself right there.
It's fun. It's fun stuff. And so John and I wrote The Exodus Reality. And that book came out late October of 2013. And it was our two different views on who the historical Moses might have been and the historical Exodus, which is a great deviation from the other things I'd been writing.
No kidding, yeah.
But Moses was somebody, when I was a kid, I was in Bible school, then I went on to Bible college, and then I went to theological seminary in the early 80s, and I was a youth pastor for a while, and I mean on and off during my career for about 10 more years after that. But I started questioning a lot of things back then, but one thing that always stuck with me was the character of Moses. I don't know what drew me to him and why I was so intrigued with him as a kid. But when I was, I think it was 14 years old, I drew this little magic marker. Think of design markers and the hundreds of spreads of colors. And I got a set of those, and I drew a comic book of Moses and the Ten Commandments and stuff like that. While most 14-year-olds were out getting in trouble, I was home drawing pictures of Moses.
Yeah, this is not very normal behavior.
No, it wasn't. But I was also a Star Trek fan, so that
explains it.
Nerddom and geekdom.
I failed to see the connection there, Moses and Star Trek. But okay.
Well, there really wasn't one, other than it made me both a nerd and a geek.
At the same time, yes.
That was my childhood. And I was a kid that I'd get my friends. I had really close friends that were very interested in the same stuff. We used to have Super 8 movie cameras, and this is back film cameras. And we would do special effects. We would do stop motion animation with spaceships and stuff like that. And that's the stuff I did in my 13, 14, 15-year-old span of life there. And but Moses was somebody, I drew that comic book, and the church I was attending liked it so much, and we were a poor family. They gave me a scholarship to go to the high school there. And so I went to the high school, and that got me into the college and the seminary. That's what really launched all of that. And I wrote papers in seminary on Moses and the educational system of the 18th dynasty. I had to peg where I believed Moses fit in. And so the theories on this started way back then. And when John and I met several years back now, one of the first questions I asked him when we started getting into serious discussions was, hey, you are an Egyptologist. You're an archaeologist in Egypt. I said, I got to ask you, what's your take on Moses? And he says, it's funny you should ask me that, Scotty. And he had a theory of his own that was very different from mine. And we have a friendly, ongoing debate about it. But our two different theories are really in the same. It's in the middle 18th dynasty, about 80 years apart within the same royal house, just two dramatically different characters. And so my first time I went over to Egypt was 2 years ago, and I went over with John, and we went for a month, and we did this research expedition going to all these places. We went out to the Sinai Desert, And you've got the picture of the Mount Sinai in your head, the traditional site, St. Catherine's, way out on the east side of the Sinai Peninsula. But there's another mountain, Serabet el Khadim, which is about halfway down the Red Sea on the east side, on the Sinai side, and in about 50 miles. And there's this little plateau mountain in this rough area. We were the guests of Sheikh Salim Barakat, who put us up in these Bedouin tents overnight, and we climbed the mountain the next day. And at the top of that mountain is the ancient ruins of the Temple of Hathor. And Hathor was the calf goddess. Think of the golden calf with the Israelites, and you get a pretty good picture. And that cave is up there, and 1,500 years' worth of pharaohs built their own little chambers off of the front of this cave. And so there's this long string of chambers all the way up to Ramesses VI. And so we were up there, and it's all ruins now, of course, and it was quiet. There was nothing there. You're out in the middle of the Sinai Desert on a mountaintop. And you said, this, I believe, is where this happened. There's too much evidence for it. And if Moses was who we both think he was, only different characters, both of us have labeled guys that were grand viziers. My guy, Senenmut, had 92 royal titles conferred on him. And all the details I won't go into, but suffice it to say, if Moses was indeed a prince of Egypt, this is what Senenmut was, a man born to commoners, as all the Egyptians say about him. He was raised to power by Hatshepsut, the female queen who became the female pharaoh. And he was there for about 40 years, and he just disappeared off the scene. Right about the same time as the biblical chronology places Moses. And so it's very interesting when you start digging into all this. But this is the guy with all of this royal training, royal upbringing. He was given the title of the hereditary crown prince of Egypt. And this guy was pharaoh in the absence of pharaoh, while he was the Grand Vizier during his first 40 years of life. And then, of course, he disappears. But what you've got to consider is when you go up to that mountaintop and you see these places, you go, these are places where this guy was. He was here. We go down to Gebel El Silsila, John and Maria's site. His shrine is there. There's all these different things, and everything about him was smashed and ruined after a certain period in time. And but you keep finding these references of him coming up. And so he was very interesting. And he was born during the reigns of Tutmosis I, Tutmosis II, Tutmosis III, Hatshepsut, all of these people. And so that's what John and I studied on a research trip. That's what that book was about. And that came out a little over a year ago. And
why do you think history and the church has changed the historical Moses the way they have?
Changed him in what respect? How do you mean?
Well, changed the name, for example, because his name wasn't Moses.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that the way John and I approach it is that in this book is that there are events that become legend and legends that become mythology. And I think the story of Moses, it's either one of two things. It's exactly as the Bible says it, which is actually pretty vague. It doesn't even tell you who the pharaohs are.
Right.
Doesn't give you any specific information historically.
Hold on. In the Old Testament, as opposed to the New Testament, it does go into description of the timeline and, who the pharaoh was at the time.
Well, in the actual Bible itself, the Old Testament, it doesn't mention anything about the pharaohs. You can get into the Mikvah, the Mishnah, all the traditional writings of the Jews. You're going to find traditional stories. There's one that talks about Moses was a great general under a pharaoh, and they give his name, and we're not quite sure which pharaoh he aligns with. But he went down to, under the command of this pharaoh, to quell a rebellion down in Sudan. And he goes down there, or Cush, so what it was called back then. And he subdues the rebellion, beheads the king. The queen is very pissed off at him, of course, and he takes the throne for himself. And then Pharaoh sends a message back saying, it's mine. You get your butt back up to Egypt. and so he abdicates the throne. And then, according to Jewish legend, Moses also, when he flees Egypt after murdering the Egyptian, we always hear he goes to the Sinai Desert, to Mount Sinai, to Midian. But the mikvah is going to tell you, Jewish traditional stories are going to tell you that no, first he went south to Cush, and he married the Cushite princess, and then several years later went out to the Sinai, and then came back to Egypt. And so there's interesting tales that are there. The Bible itself is just void of any kind of pharaonic name, and that's why there is such a the only pharaoh that's mentioned in the Exodus account is Ramesses, and so people mistakenly plug Ramesses as if you just saw the recent Ridley Scott movie Exodus. He again followed the Ramesside theory. If you look at the old Charlton Heston movie, Yul Brynner, Ramses II, Ramses was always it, because it's only because of one little verse in the book of Exodus that says the children of Israel, while they were slaves, built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. And of course, Ramses the Great built those cities. And so they said, oh, well, there's our hinge pin. The Israelites were slaves under Ramses II because he built those cities. The problem with that is, it's like asking the question, who built New York City? And you could say the Dutch. Well, no, they didn't. The Dutch built New Amsterdam. It was the English who came in and built New York City on top of or expanded New Amsterdam. Same thing happened with the Israelites. When that scripture was rewritten, if Moses is truly the author of the book of Exodus, he would have penned that around 1400 BC, thereabouts. But it wasn't until just before 400 BC, that after the Babylonian captivity, that all the 72 rabbis came and got the permission of Ptolemy II to go to the Library of Alexandria to recompile the scriptures. And they went there for two purposes: to bolster the faithful of Israel and to reestablish the eradicated history of Israel. And so they wanted to go through all the documents that were there at the Library of Alexandria. And they recompiled basically the Old Testament we have today. They wrote the Greek version, the Septuagint. And that Septuagint is really what we have now as the Old Testament. But I think this is where they were missing information. By this time, 1,000 years after the fact, they may not have had a handle on all the pharaohs' names.
Right.
Moses never put them in. They certainly didn't know where Mount Sinai was. This is very clear in Israelite history. During the time of David, they couldn't remember where Mount Sinai was.
Also, Scotty, after 1,000 years have gone by, I mean, how much of the story could be even considered legitimate? You know how humans embellish stories from one end to the other, 1 year to the next?
Well, that's the big question that John and I pursued, because now the Israelites were meticulous on their oral tradition, and they learned these stories and passed them down. Same thing you get if you go into a synagogue today, not citing any particular ceremony or anything like that, but these are all oral traditions passed down for generations. And so they had this when they returned from Babylon. This is why they went to the Library of Alexandria, the Smithsonian Institute, the Library of Congress, if you will, of its day. And they wanted to look up all this old information, and they spent years writing the Septuagint, recompiling the Hebrew scriptures. And what's very interesting when they did this, I kind of got off the point, but the point I was making with the Library of Alexandria was when you look at Ramesses, the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses being built by the children of Israel in the book of Exodus. Well, and I brought up that example of New Amsterdam and New York and the Dutch and so on. What they were writing in 400 was what they knew. They knew that the Hebrews built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. Well, those were the current name places of those for the last 800 plus years, Pithom and Ramses. But what they don't write in there is that Pithom and Ramses were built on top of Avaris, which was a city built 250 to 500 years earlier. That's the city that was built by the Hebrews. or by the children of Israel. All Ramses did was he rebuilt those cities and turned them into his treasure cities, which is what he did with everything. And one of the key historical points, without getting into it too deep, but do you remember after the Exodus, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they come into the promised land. Moses dies, of course, and Joshua takes over. Their first thing, they sack the city of Jericho. And the old stories, they blew the great trump and the walls came tumbling down. And now what's very interesting is, and I don't know the Aramaic name of it, or the Tell in the middle of current-day Jericho is the old city. And there's been years and years of excavation work done on this, where they're finding that the walls did indeed tumble down. And, of course, they're trying to find the scientific reason for this. And what's interesting is that Tell dates back to right around 1400 BC when it was ruined. And it was never dwelt in again for 800 years.
Wow.
Now, Ramesses reigned in the 1200s, 200 years after that event. So if the children of Israel were having the Exodus under Ramses, how did they sack the city of Jericho 200 years earlier after the Exodus? So these are the points of history we start to look at in this book. And that's just one of them. But we look at all different kinds of things, and there's so many things to establish these characters. And the fact that, there's not a lot of history out there in Egypt. There's very few pharaohs. There were no pharaohs, who put inscriptions on their temple walls that said, "And my slave people kicked my ass last month." It's not there. So you're not going to find that. But what you're going to find are trace little bits and pieces of evidence from all over the place. That creates a very viable picture.
Now, after writing this book, what are your thoughts of the movie Exodus that came out with Christian Bale this past year?
I liked it. There were elements of it I liked and elements I didn't like. I'm not one of those rampant, oh my God, don't go watch it. I can't believe he's got Moses talking to a kid.
I wanted to see the Michael Bay edition. That would have been better, I think.
Oh, the Michael Bay edition would have been very cool.
Christian Bale would have been blowing something up. You just know that this is going to happen.
I thought Christian Bale played a pretty good Moses. Because now, for me, when I heard that Ridley Scott was just doing really a very updated version of the Ten Commandments it was his remake of the Ten Commandments,
right?
And it's still Ramesses, and I remember getting irate because there is not. I will put the challenge out there and probably not be answered, but I don't think there is an Egyptologist worth his salt today that can hold to a Ramessian theory of the Exodus. It's just too damn late in history. And there's no archaeological evidence at all. You want absence of evidence for an Exodus? Go look at the Ramesside period. But he uses Ramses again, Ramses II. And I thought Joel, whatever his last name is, I can't remember, who played Ramses, did a phenomenal job of playing Ramses. You've really got to get into the mindset of the characters. So he did a great job. I thought Christian Bale did a great job. Even though they were both white guys and Brits, they did a great job.
I was going to ask you that, and I wanted to present that as a gentle question.
Sure.
What do you think of the whitewashing of having Moses played by a British white dude?
There's a part of me that says, it's okay, it's acting. And to hell,
Right.
I played Joseph the Carpenter in a Sunday school pageant when I was a kid. I'm not Jewish, but I still played him. Very different, of course. Christian Bale, I think, did an excellent job. It's okay. It doesn't bother me that you've got actors portraying people. We've got actors portraying aliens. We've got Mexicans portraying Palestinians. We've got Brits portraying rednecks from the deep south. So Walking Dead. Rick, the lead character, he's a Brit. The actor's a Brit.
Yeah, he's British. Yeah.
Some people
you would never know that by watching that show.
You never know it.
Amazing actor.
And the governor was British too.
Yeah. Also.
Anyway, all that to say is that I think I don't have as big a problem seeing white actors playing these parts. It doesn't matter. It's a job. It's an actor. It's entertainment.
Right. And also, if you want realism like that, they're going to have to speak in Hebrew also, not English.
Well, that's right. Well, I thought Mel Gibson actually did a pretty good job with his Jesus of Nazareth in certain aspects. He did that in the Aramaic and things like that. But I guess if I had my dream chance of directing a big major motion picture about Moses, which will probably not get done now for another 50 years. Thanks, Ridley Scott. But
I think probably a lot. The way Hollywood is going, I think it'll be a lot sooner than that.
It probably will be. I would love to see characters like there was a character that I thought would play a fantastic Moses. He's an Israeli actor, and we've all seen him. If you saw the Mummy movies with
Imhotep.
Not him. The guy
with the beard.
The guy with the black robes and the black turban, the tattoos, the defenders of the whatever,
Yeah, the guy had the beard. He was also in Deuce Bigelow, male gigolo.
Yeah, guy is an Israeli actor. I thought he could have played a marvelous Moses. He's a fantastic actor. I think you could have found characters to do that, but I don't think it's necessary. But I think it would be kind of cool to do that sometime. And of course,
it definitely adds a little bit of authentic flavor to the movie. I mean, it does add that authenticity.
It does
to the picture,
or at least, damn it, go get a tan. They're so white, they're almost invisible. But now here's my thing: is that I've got a specific character that I really believe, I'd say 98%, a 2% shadow of a doubt, because none of us can be sure of this stuff until we're absolutely sure. But my candidate for Moses, I believe, is the guy that was Moses. And the story is completely different because it's not set under Ramses. It's not set the same way. Let me give you, is it all right to give you a quick highlight of why I have chosen this guy?
Go ahead.
Senenmut is the name of the man that I believe was Moses. Now, Senenmut. And if you go to biblical history, look at the date when Solomon, the son of David, it says builds and dedicates the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem, Temple 1. Now, there's dispute over whether David and Solomon even existed, which I think is ridiculous. There are people doing so much work on this. These guys existed. But whoever it was, let's say Solomon, put aside the dispute that he existed, the king of Israel dedicated Temple 1 in Jerusalem. And with the evidences that they have, there's a median date of about 966 BC, give or take only 3 or 4 years in either direction of the date of the founding of Temple 1 in Jerusalem. Now, if that is the date that we know historically, Temple 1, 966 BC, give or take a year or two. The Bible has a verse in 1 Kings 6:1 that says, and on the day that Solomon dedicated the temple in Jerusalem, it was the 480th year from the day of the Exodus. And so now that's obviously a round figure. It's probably like 479 in 6 months. Who knows what it was, but it's 480th year to the day of the Exodus. And so if you do your math from 966 BC, add 480, you ended up with 1446 BC as a date of the Exodus. Now, you look at that, and the first question you have to ask is, what is the efficacy of biblical history? Is the historicity of the Old Testament viable and reliable? And I hear people say, well, it can't be because it's a book of faith, and it's all, or people go even worse than that. They'll say, oh, it's just all garbage, it's all mythology. And I said, well, I disagree with you. You can have authentic, real, viable history contained in a book of faith. It doesn't mean you have to abide by the faith story or necessarily take on board the faith that's wrapped around that story.
Right.
The event itself, the events, the historical dates, and there's been, frankly, Angel, so much biblical archaeology over the last 150 years that almost every little detail of history in the Old Testament has either been verified or they are working on it, and there is so much information out there, it's unbelievable. And so when the Bible gives you that date, it's probably a fairly reliable date historically. You don't have to believe the faith story around it. Now, if you go to 1446 into Egypt, you get a bigger problem. you have to figure out who was on the throne. You think it'd be as easy as saying who was on the throne in 1446. Well, there's actually 5 different chronologies of the Egyptian kings that kind of look at like a slide rule or 3-dimensional slide rule and start taking all these 5 and shifting the dates all around back and forth. And this is what was going on, because where the accepted Oxford chronology of the Egyptian kings might say Amenhotep II was on the throne in 1446 BC. But then there's another version of the chronology of the kings that will set that back 20 years or 8 years or 10 years. They were shifting all over the place because they weren't sure if this guy was a co-regent or this guy was, his queen ruled for a year before he took the throne or whatever. And so you run into this chronology problem. So I went with just simply the accepted Oxford. And I said, by this dating system, there was a guy on the throne in 1446 named Amenhotep II. He was a brash young ruler. He came to the throne at 18. And in the 5th year of his reign, after several military campaigns, the Exodus takes place. Now, without getting into those details, let's go backwards now. If Moses, according to the Bible, was around 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, right. If that was 1446, you can go back 80 years and get 1526 BC as the year of his birth. So now if he was born in 1526 or thereabouts, it would have been in the first year or two of the reign of Tutmosis I. And Tutmosis I had a daughter. Her name was Hatshepsut, or Matakare was her name, and her royal name was Hatshepsut. And she was called, it was an actual title. She bore the title, Pharaoh's daughter. Now, in the book of Exodus, it says Pharaoh's daughter found him. I actually believe it's kind of a semi-sweet thing when you think about it, is that Moses doesn't name anybody in the Bible, but he gives homage to the person that was called his stepmother in Egypt, and I believe later his lover. But go figure that one out.
Yeah, creepy.
But she was only about 8 to 9 years older than he was. And it says she finds him in the Nile. The Bible passage, she finds him in the Nile, sends him back to his mother till she's old enough to claim him. Then she claims him and takes him to Egypt. Then the story jumps ahead 40 years. You miss everything that took place. In her life, in Egyptian history, it doesn't say anything about a child, but she bore the title Pharaoh's daughter. And I think this was an homage to her in Moses' book.
Here's a question real quick,
yeah.
not to cut you off, not to stop you. This is very similar in a lot of areas to the story of Jesus.
It is, in a way.
Yeah, how much do you think the story of Jesus is lifted directly from the story of Moses?
Not a lot of the Moses story, but they compare the Moses story with the basket and so on in the Nile to Osiris. And they say Osiris was like an early archetype of what Jesus would be. Right. And now, there's an interesting thing about that I want to bring up, and I wrote about this in the book. I say people say, oh, this didn't happen to Moses. It's just obviously, this is the myth of Moses because it looks exactly like the Osiris story. And I said, have you ever stopped to consider that perhaps Moses' mother, who by this time, these Israelites were very Egyptianized. They were living in this culture. And I said, do you think for a moment that maybe she knew the story of Osiris? And do you think she knew exactly where the Pharaoh's daughter was going to be bathing? And do you think when it says she sent her daughter Miriam to follow the basket because they knew exactly what time of day and where, and I can't remember how it's worded, but where the Pharaoh's daughter was bathing with her servants. And it also says they didn't set this basket out into this main expanse of the river Nile to be, fodder for crocodiles and things like that, and that it drifted down the main channel.
Very lucky baby, by the way.
Very lucky baby. What the verse actually says was she took the basket and placed it amongst the reeds on the banks of the Nile, and where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. So she put it there, and she sent her daughter to watch. And do you think for a moment that perhaps Moses' mother was a pretty smart cookie? She knew what the story of Osiris was all about, and she played right into the Egyptian story. And she put him in a basket just like Osiris, puts him in the Nile just like Osiris. And because she's playing into
recreating history.
She's recreating it.
Yeah.
For the purpose of drawing that spiritual element in. And
Right.
so if this was indeed Hatshepsut, she was not much more than 9 to 10 years old. She found this child. The Bible says she sends him back to his mother until she's old enough to take him. Now, here's an interesting thing. In Hatshepsut's story, she raises a young man to power by bringing him into her household, making him the steward of her household. He tutored her daughter. Tutors to the royal kids were generally generals of armies or high officials or high nobility. They weren't your little schoolmarms. She brings this guy into her household, and he tutors her daughter. His name is Senenmut. Now, Senenmut, literally translated in Egyptian, means mother's brother. And so what happens here, I believe, is Hatshepsut gave him his... Oh, we know she gave him the name Senenmut in Egyptian history. And so we don't know this is Moses in Egyptian history. We just know it's a guy. It says, born to commoners, she raises him to power. She gives him the name Senenmut. Senenmut means mother's brother. Or in other words, I, your mother, elevate you to the status of brother to the gods with me. And then she gives him 92 other royal titles. And I already mentioned some of these. Amongst them were the Grand Vizier of Egypt, which is really the pharaoh in the place of pharaoh.
Right.
And she gives him the hereditary crown prince of Egypt, amongst many other priestly titles and 92 royal titles. Now, what's very interesting about this guy is about the time he turns 40, which is about the time that Moses would have turned 40, around 40 years, 1486 BC. Thereabouts, Senenmut completely disappears out of Egyptian history. He's got two amazingly grandiose tombs. You can visit them today. He's got an astrological calendar on the ceiling of one of his tombs that is still accurate today. It's just an amazing calendar and star chart. And so this guy has two amazing tombs. He's never buried in them. They're never even finished. There's no record of how he dies. We do know that he was a close courtier to the queen, Hatshepsut. Now think of Hatshepsut, almost think of Elizabeth I of England. She had that kind of a reign, and very peaceful, but very in power as a woman. And he would be like the Essex kind of a guy. He was the constant lifelong lover, I think, and these were the theories about them. And there's even pornographic drawings on a cave.
I've seen some of that. Yes, I've seen some of the cave.
Up above her temple, the workers' cave. Yes. I was up in there, and I took a picture of that where it's got Senenmut shagging Hatshepsut. And
don't they have some of this stuff like blocked out? So when tourists go, like the penis is blocked out, and some of these things. Well,
not on that one. You can't really. Tourists aren't allowed up there. We got up there because John knows people. He's an archaeologist, and the government guys were there with us to walk us up the mountainside. And so it was pretty cool, but you can't just go up there as a tourist unless you get governmental.
No, but they found, and I saw this recently. They found cave art or art in Egyptian pyramids that have a pornographic. They're pornographic in nature, and part of tours in Egypt, they actually cover up the private parts of.
What's very interesting. I saw a lot of the god Min, who is the god. You think it's a like a head shop gift or something. But you see these little Egyptian statues of the little guy with the huge penis sticking out, huge erection. That's the god Min, and he's all over all these temples. And you don't see it blocked out anywhere. I think where you may, I'm just guessing on this, but I think the Coptic Christians took over a lot of these sites 1,700 years ago. And they plastered over a lot of this stuff. And all of that. That might be where some of that is from. But you can go to any big major temple site. You can go to Ramses Temple and see Min with a big boner right there on the sidewall of his temple. So it's like, wow, hey. I remember I took a picture of that and sent it home to my wife.
Yeah, they don't teach you. They don't talk about this kind of stuff on Ancient Aliens.
No, they don't. No, they don't. Well,
I'd like to see Giorgio Tsoukalos talk about this, actually, to be honest with you.
I don't think he could. Well, did I say that out loud? Giorgio, I love you in a certain kind of weird way. So, but
I just love his hair.
My daughter got to touch his hair at the symposium.
Oh, that's so cool.
Paradigm Symposium in 2012. So he was very cool. He was very nice to have here. I will say that. I think he's a bizarre little fellow, but he was a nice guy.
But has great hair.
Has great hair. Boy, his career's going to go like down the tubes if he goes bald.
You know what I'm saying? That's a career killer right there for him. But at some point, he'll start wearing a wig like Michael Jackson.
There it is. Just as long as he doesn't do the nose thing.
Yeah, he's already light-skinned, but that's a different story.
Well, if I can get on sentiment for one more second here.
Yeah, please, we're derailing completely.
This is just a story that I can talk forever on it, so I'm trying to encapsulate it, but he's got all this stuff. He's the Grand Vizier. He's all of this. He left behind 9 statues of him with loving, embracing the young princess. Things he was very close to Hatshepsut, but he disappears, and she dies nearly almost the same time. Now, the interesting thing about Hatshepsut, she was the daughter of Thutmose I. He dies, leaves his son Thutmose II as the pharaoh, and his daughter Hatshepsut, or Matakari at the time, and he marries them. This was just the way they did, to strengthen the blood, And so they were brother and sister married, and he was weak and sickly. Go figure. He dies right around 27 or 28 years old, something like that. She claims the throne, even though his 3-year-old son by a harem wife is the next pharaoh, Thutmose III. But he's only 3 years old at the time of his father's death, so Hatshepsut takes over. And she actually co-regent with him for about 6 years. Then she, for all practical purposes, deposes him and pushes him aside, puts him in the royal school, all of this and that, and he ends up being the general of her armies, and there's still a peaceful thing going on there. But she reigned for over 20 years. And when she dies, Senenmut has disappeared from the scene. Thutmose III comes to the throne right around 30, 31 years old. And he takes that throne with a vigor. And he's been waiting in the wings. He's been the military commander. She never really had any major battles other than possibly in Punt and other places. But she had more trade missions and things. But he starts to eradicate some of her statuary and some of her. They did on temples what was called erasure, where a new pharaoh would literally scrape off the old pharaoh's cartouche and put their own in his place. A very famous example of erasure, the Abydos glyph, the Abydos lintel that shows the helicopter and the tank and all of that. Yes. And people look at that and they say, see, there's
ancient aliens. Yeah, UFOs.
And
aliens.
I say, I remember I was in a discussion online with somebody. I said, I hate to be the killjoy at this buzz party here. I said, but because I love the ancient alien theme. I said, but I got to tell you something. I said, that ain't ancient helicopters. I said, that is a product of erasure, where one pharaoh would come and scrape off the other pharaoh's name, put his in the place, either paint it over, plaster it over, chisel it off, scrape it off, dig in a new one. And the Abydos lintel is a prime example of erasure having been done 3 times over. And you can actually, with infrared cameras now, they've gone in, and you can separate out the 3 different layers and see pretty much everything that was there. And the inscriptions are intact. And so you can see 3 different versions of inscription on top of each other. But when you look at the different layers, you can see how when they laid across each other, you got something that looks kind of like a helicopter here.
Right.
Because there's a swoop of this that's part of that one, a nick of this that's part of that one, and so on. And I showed the pictures, and I was in a discussion, and people were like, you're part of the conspiracy to cover that.
You nasty debunker.
You got to be kidding me. I said, come on, isn't it more exciting to see that there were 3 different pharaohs who used the same block? I said, isn't that exciting to you to learn what's underneath it? And, but anyway, that's erasure.
And then somewhere Giorgio Tsoukalos showed up and said, no, it has to be aliens.
Has to be aliens. Well, when Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III started wiping out her stuff, but he stopped. He fell short of that, and they did this to prove I am now the king. I am now the guy, and so I'm taking over this temple. I'm doing this, and it was interesting. He reigns for almost 40 years, and in his old age, his young son Amenhotep II comes to the throne at age 18, and he is the one who pushes his father. He says, I'm Pharaoh now. I'm going to finish this job. There was apparently some animosity there. And he goes in and he eradicates every image of Hatshepsut off her own temple, that very famous temple of Jesher at Deir el-Bahri in Luxor, that colonnaded low temple in the rock face. He took every image of her off. He crushed her statues. Everything of her was gone, with very rare exception. And what's very interesting is at the same time now, this is 40 years after his disappearance, he also not only eradicates every image of Hatshepsut, the queen, but it eradicates every image of Senenmut. And I have a working theory that's pure speculation, based on educated conjecture, but it was my take. I speculated, do you think that perhaps when he was eradicating Hatshepsut, he also eradicated Senenmut because Senenmut had come back as Moses after that 40-year stint? And all this crap took place under his reign in the first 5 years of his reign, and what does he do? He eradicates all their images.
That makes perfect sense.
Senenmut included. And now, I don't know that that's the fact, but I do know that it makes some sense, but I speculated.
It does, yeah.
So all of this stuff starts to point to this man, Senenmut, as being very possibly my candidate, I think, for Moses. And there are other aspects, of course, I wrote a whole book about it with John, so well, half the book is mine. But right. This is a man that there's a lot of, where you don't have firsthand evidence, archaeologically speaking, you can hail to secondhand information to establish the story. There is, if I can wax biblical for a couple of more minutes, remember the beginning of the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt, as it was called, and that they were there, the Bible says, for about 400 years. Their family was there. But how did it start? Jacob, also named Israel, had his 12 sons who became the leaders of the 12 tribes. They were just a tribal family, a Bedouin family in Canaan. And, of course, the brothers sell off Joseph into slavery. We know the whole story. How much of that is fanciful, we don't know. But he ends up in Egypt and eventually, over a number of years, has risen to power and becomes the Grand Vizier of Egypt. And then his brothers come to him. It's 20 years later. They don't even know he's alive. He's the Grand Vizier of Egypt. They don't recognize him. They have to come to him to get permission to graze their flocks in Goshen, the fertile one of it's to the west and the north of Cairo, what is today present-day Cairo. They were ruling in Memphis at that time. They're in the north, the capital of the north, and his brothers come and ask permission of the Grand Vizier to graze. And we know the story, and Joseph doesn't reveal himself right away, and so on. But when he finally does, there's a big crying on everybody, we thought you were dead, and God meant it for good, and kind of thing. There's the biblical lesson there. But the interesting thing is that Joseph says to his brothers, now, I'm going to give you this land of Goshen, and you have to go into Pharaoh and present yourselves as the family of Jacob, and I'm going to present you as my brothers. He says, but when you go in, this is the biblical passage, when you go in, he says, tell the king that you are shepherds and that you have been shepherds from the days of your youth, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. I thought, what the hell does that mean? And I glossed over that so much when I was here. Why is he telling them the Egyptians hate you guys, so tell them this is what you do?
Right.
Well, the interesting thing is that the Hyksos, one of the original meanings of this was that they were the shepherding peoples from the Middle East, from the Canaanite region, the Syrian region, and so on. When the Hyksos came in, they'd for centuries, about 800 years, been coming into the Delta region, infiltrating, just bringing their flocks in. And of course, they moved into the towns and the cities, and they became the people of the cities, and they got into the civic stuff in the cities, and they eventually took over in government, and they eventually overthrew the northern kingdom of Egypt. And they established their own pharaohship up in the north for about 108 years. And during this time, these Hyksos people were the ones who did this. They had their own monarchy, and then the Egyptian monarchy was down in the south. So the Hyksos, by definition, were the shepherding peoples from the east. They were also known as the Asiatics, who came from the Canaanite region. And so these shepherding peoples are actually peoples of the same Semitic bloodstock as the children of Israel were. They're all from the Middle East. And so Joseph says to him in his position as Grand Vizier, when you go to Pharaoh, tell him you're shepherds, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. Why did he say that? Because these aren't the Egyptian kings. This is these Hyksos kings. And it kind of establishes really a plausible setting for when this took place. And why was Joseph, a Semitic Canaanite, a Bedouin kid, elevated to a position of Grand Vizier? Was it just because he interpreted dreams? I could do that too. It's like, oh, Angel, let's see. Yeah, that dream about the onion, it means this, and and so on. You can do all of that. Right. I'm not saying it was fake, but that's why the Bible says he was elevated, because of his gifts in interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. But I think it's also because they were cousins. They were blood brothers. They were all of the same blood stock. And this is why then, at the end of that period, remember in the Bible it says, and Joseph and all his brothers died, and they were buried, and so on. And it says, and then a new king came to the throne of Egypt, who knew not Joseph, or in other words, had no regard for Joseph. Right. And he said, the Hebrews or the Israelites are growing too numerous, and he slaps them into bondage. Well, Amos the first, who was the father of Tutmosis the first, who was the father of Hatshepsut, so her grandfather, came in and cleared the Hyksos out of the northern kingdom and reunited the kingdom of Egypt. But what did they do? They took the remnant of all these people and in essence put them into servitude, into bondage, so they wouldn't rise up against them. What does the biblical passage say? This king who didn't know Joseph slaps them all into slavery and says, we're going to put them in slavery lest they rejoin our enemies and retake our nation from us, is what it says in the biblical passage. This would have been Amos the first saying, we don't want these guys to realign with anybody and to slap them into bondage, which was a common practice. So it's things like this, and I'll stop on the storytelling with this stuff there. It is things like this as you start to look at these biblical stories where you have to go extrapolate some secondhand information. But what you can start establishing is maybe not rock-solid first-hand fact, but you can establish a line of plausibility. And if that plausibility exists, I think there's room for the story. And so these are the people. Senenmut is the guy, I believe, was Moses.
That's an amazing story. Look, it's fascinating to me. That's why I didn't have much to say, but yeah. It really is a fascinating correlation there. Let me ask you a question, though, Scott, because this is something that I've been looking at more and more in the last few years. What is and now we're speeding up and moving forward here a few hundred years, but what do you think there is a legitimate connection between the pharaohs of Egypt and the current monarch in England, for example? Because I've heard and I've read different things where the families of Egypt, of some of the pharaohs, are pretty much the ones that seated the current monarch in England.
I've got a rough time with that. I will be the first to admit I don't know enough information about that, because I haven't made that any kind of a particular area of study. So I don't know that topic very well. But I will tell you this, that I believe we have such a handle on what we know about pharaonic Egypt, even up into the Greco-Roman period, when it really faded away into nothing. When you're talking Greco-Roman, you're looking at Cleopatra the First, Cleopatra the Second, and so on. These kings, I do not believe, laid the groundwork for any kind of British monarchy. There is, however, a different version of that, which says that, and this is very, very interesting. It ties to the Exodus. When Moses led the people out of Egypt, these people, by the way, were not all that committed to Moses. He was the guy doing the thing, and he let them out. And remember when they got to Mount Sinai, and he goes up into the mountain, he's up there for 40 days, and the people come to Aaron, his brother, and say, where is this man Moses? It says in the Bible. In the vernacular translation, that means, where's this guy? This Moses, this guy who let us out. He has disappeared. Build us an idol that we can worship. And what they build him? An Egyptian god, the golden calf, Hathor. They're at her mountain. That's why. Anyway, so when they're in this Exodus, the tribe of Dan breaks off from the rest of the Israelites. It's in the Bible, and it says, and they went north. Gone. Tribe of Dan. See you, Dan. And but what's very interesting is, let's move forward a little bit, then backwards again. In Ireland, there is the ancient mythology of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And the Tuatha Dé Danann are basically the elven folk. This is who they became. But the Tuatha, in the old pre-Celtic Ireland, we're talking the megalith era, the Tuatha were the bright, shining kings, tall, elegant, shining kings who descended from heaven, and they intermingled. Think of the Nephilim. It's the same story with the Watchers of the Nephilim, the tall, elegant, bright, shining ones, the Watchers. Well, they all came down, and there were the wars, and they were driven into the hollow hills and became known as the Elven folk. And Elven, by the way, the L in there is the El of Elohim, the El of El Elyon of El, the Hebrew name for God. But that's who the Elven folk were. So now the Tuatha Dé Danann were, Tuatha basically means the people of, or those of, and a day is a reference to deity, and Anu or Danu, the Tuatha Dé Danann is to the goddess Danu, children of the goddess Danu, or the people of the goddess Danu.
Danu, right?
Danu, and it's now Danu is also very closely linked with the tribe of Dan, and there were the Danoi, who were said to have left Egypt from Moses and went north up the Nile, and out into the Mediterranean, crossed the Mediterranean to the Minoans. They became, and then they moved over into northern Israel, and up in way north in the north of Israel is the site that they believe the Danoi existed. Some of the same archaeological evidence is there for the Danoi that's over in the Minoan Islands, or the Greek islands. And so there's a belief that there's a connection here. The Dan, the Danoi, the Danu, but it's also been rendered the Tuatha Dé Anu. And the Anu is, of course, a linkage to the people of the Anunnaki.
Right.
And, of course, we all know the Anunnaki through the much ado about the Anunnaki in ancient alien studies.
Right.
I didn't want to say studies, research.
Wow.
And so I use that
Tales.
word. Tales. And the Anunnaki, of course, were just the gods, the god caste, like the Olympians were to the Greeks, the Anunnaki were to the ancient Sumerians, Mesopotamians. And you can read all about them in the cuneiform tablets. You can find some great books. And by the way, you want a great, wonderful, fun, exciting, sexy night with your loved one? Get a copy of the translation of the cuneiform texts of the Anunnaki and the Tale of Atrahasis. Man, this stuff's exciting.
Yeah, but see, if you do that, if you put one of those out with your girl, chances are you're going to end up single.
I got to tell you something. When I was writing the Reptilian book, I was reading in Daly, I think her last name is Stephanie Daly, who did the translation, a modern translation of these cuneiform texts. And the story in it was, I was like, oh my God. And I ran upstairs and I woke up my wife. It's about 2:45 in the morning. I said, Raini, Are you awake? And she sat up on her. She's so cool. She loves me so much. Because she puts up with me. She sits up on her elbow and she puts her chin in her hand. She goes, "Yeah, what do you got?" And I said, "You have got to hear this account of the Anunnaki from the cuneiform texts." She's like, "Okay, let her rip, baby." I read this, and she put up with me. But it's an exciting read, frankly. And it was exciting when you can shed light on history and all these things we hear and then look at it where it comes from, the source point. And as a matter of fact, hold on. I know I'm on live radio here, but
live radio. So we're going to hold and have dead air for a second.
Here in my bookshelf,
great radio.
Is the scintillating live radio.
Yes.
I've got, it's called The Myths from Mesopotamia, The Creation, Flood Myth, Gilgamesh, and Others, translated by Stephanie Daly. And if this is dog-eared enough, I should be able to open right to the spot. But some of this stuff was absolutely incredible, the way it reads and the way the story reads. And it's got the creation where Enlil, or Enlil, the chief god, conscribes his brother god Enki to create primeval man to do our work for us, to dig our trenches, to mine our resources, to till our ground, and so on. And Enki does this. And it's very interesting that the story is very similar to the Garden of Eden story. And when you start reading in this cuneiform text, now there was one Atrahasis. Listen to how this reads. This is English translation of the cuneiform. Okay. Now there was one Atrahasis whose ear was open to his god Enki. He would speak with his god, and his god would speak with him. Atrahasis made his voice heard and spoke to his lord. "How long will the gods make us suffer? Will they make us suffer illness forever?" Enki made his voice heard and spoke to his servant. "Call the elders, the senior men, start an uprising in your own house. Let heralds proclaim, let them be loud noise in the land. Do not revere your gods, do not pray to your goddesses, but search out the door of Namatara. Bring a baked loaf into his presence. May the flour offering reach him. May he be shamed by the presence and wipe away his hand." Atrahasis took the order, gathered the elders to his door. Atrahasis made his voice heard and spoke to the elders. And the story goes on. This was the rebellion of Atrahasis against the gods when the humans won their freedom. And it was Enki who was condemned, and he and his followers, to the subterranean caverns of the earth to dwell forever because they gave the forbidden knowledge of the gods. And you compare that to the Genesis story and so on.
Right.
But
right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
All of this, your original question was about the pharaonic line, and I got off on the Danu.
No, but you know what? That makes perfect correlation, and actually, it does make perfect sense that it would be similar to the Garden of Eden story when you consider that a lot of the Bible and a lot of the stories in the Bible are very similar to older stories. For example, Noah and Gilgamesh.
Well, and I just crossed over the Gilgamesh epic when I was flipping through here. What's very, very interesting is that the biblical story of the Garden of Eden and some of the creation myths, the flood story, the creation myth, the flood story, and so on, as they appear in the book of Genesis, are really how would I say this? If Moses, when he created Judaism, and he didn't create it, he codified it.
Right.
When he codified Judaism, he really codified it out of whole cloth. He had Canaanite religion that he incorporated with Egyptian spirituality, with Cushite spirituality, with Sinaitic, with Mesopotamian, and you see all of these things really wrapped into what he created Judaism with. And he created Judaism out of whole cloth. Now, there's one very, very interesting passage that we're all very familiar with, that I got a totally new take on when I was researching this. And I got this information from David Rohl, who is quite the Egyptologist. He's an agnostic a lot like me, but he writes about biblical things. And maybe you wouldn't be able to tell this by listening to me, but I'm a complete agnostic because I just don't know. I don't know who God is anymore. And but that does not mean I am not drawn to it. So he wrote about Enki. I'm sorry, about the scene with Moses, where Moses is at the burning bush. And remember that great familiar passage that we've all heard and not all of us even know anything about what it means, where Moses says, "So, whom shall I tell the people sent me?" And God said, "You tell them I am sent you. I am that I am." And that's what he did. I'm that I am. I am that I am. And we always pronounce it, I am that I am. But what he's saying is, I am that I am that they speak of. All right? Now, that's what he tells him. Now, what's very interesting, that's in Hebrew where it's written down, but it's an ancient Mesopotamian wordplay that's incorporated into the Hebrew. And without getting into the cold, hard, eye-glossing, stale linguistics of language, which, by the way, can be really cool when it's really revealing like this. But do you know what that phrase actually meant? It was a wordplay in ancient Mesopotamian, and it meant this. In essence, literally, what was being said in that passage was, "Whom shall I say sent me?" And God said, "You tell them, I am sent you. I am that Enki they speak of." The second I am was a wordplay for the name Enki.
Right.
Out of Mesopotamia. And so, in essence, God is either one, and it doesn't give an explanation in the language. We don't know if he's equating himself to Enki, saying, "Enki? Hey, that's me." Or is he saying, "I am that guy they call Enki? Well, that's really me."
Right.
We don't know which connotation is there, but what's fascinating to me is that the connotation is there at all. So here is a mention of, I am that Enki they speak of. And who supposedly penned this? It was Moses who penned this. So it's interesting stuff when you start looking at these stories and saying there's more to it. Now, when you talk about the Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, the Tuatha De Danu, the Tuatha De Anu, it's supposedly this tribe of Israel broke off and went up into the northern Mesopotamian region,
right,
where they ended up, and they intermingled with the remnant of the tribe of the Anunnaki, those who worship the Anunnaki, and the great serpent culture. And they intermingled, and they moved west. And as they moved west, they founded the great royal houses of Europe, what would become Europe.
Right.
And they, and remember, this is 1400 BC, thereabouts. And so in a millennium...
And here comes my connection to the British monarchs.
And there's your connection to the British monarchs.
Now, not only that, look, I read an article a couple of years ago, back actually in 2011, I believe, where they were talking about that up to 70% of all British folks are actually related to the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun.
You know, it's interesting. I've heard that, and I haven't seen the proof of that or the evidence of it, meaning I just haven't researched it, so I don't know diddly squat about it. But I've just heard that. And that's very interesting because they talk about how this mixing of Israelite and northern Mesopotamian founded the house, the house of Gwynedd. I'm pronouncing that wrong. Welsh is always. And they founded all these royal houses. And if they indeed did this, you've got some linkage, not necessarily from Pharaoh himself, but you've got this linkage down through the ages from the Hebrew blood, and they were in Egypt and so on. Now, I happen to think that it gets a little too fantastical for me when I start hearing the things about it. Well, Akhenaten was actually, Jesus or something like that. I go, wait, what timeline are you living in?
Yeah, the one that gets me, and I'm a follower or maybe somewhat, believer of this person might have been the historical Jesus, quote unquote, was Caesar Caesarion, the son of Caesar or Julius Caesar. That story to me, it's very, very close to the Jesus story. If you have not talked to him, you ought to talk to and get as a guest a man named Jeff Dougherty. And he just wrote the book last year and released it, Apostle Paul Antichrist.
And now it's a very interesting book. It's not as damning as that title makes it sound. It's not like, the Apostle Paul was really Satan. It wasn't that. But he writes this one more in a fictional narrative to get the point across. Now he's done a follow-up book, which is going to be coming out pretty soon. I can't remember the title, but dealing with some of the same things. But his contention is this: during first century Judea, there were 4 messianic sects, 4 major ones. And the 4 major ones are the ones that kind of won out over everyone else. If you saw Monty Python's The Life of Brian,
that's it right there, yeah.
And you see the what was the league that they were all part of? Oh, you remember what I'm talking about, I
remember, Roman, but the name, it slips my tongue right now. But I know exactly what you're talking about.
Romans go home and whatever. But the interesting thing about that is these 4 messianic sects represented 4 different political messianic sects. There was the Jewish, if you will, the Jewish messianic sect, which was Peter, led by Peter. You had the Herodian messianic sect, which was led by the Apostle Paul. And Peter and Paul were constantly going at it in the New Testament. These guys were not friendly with each other, and they did not care for each other's theology. But they supposedly are in the same New Testament. And, well, they are in the same New Testament. There's the theory that Jeff writes about in this book is the idea that Pauline Christianity hijacked real Christianity. And it's an interesting stuff. And Paul was the Apostle Paul was the cousin to he was a Herodian, the cousin to Herod Antipas. That's what I'm looking for. And this is what he was upholding, was the Herodian or Roman, really, Christianity. And it's an interesting study. You got to talk to him. I should get his name to you. But
I'm definitely going to look him up now. Are you kidding?
Yeah, he's pretty amazing, Jeff Dougherty. But that is the kind of stuff in the New Testament where you start to look at it and you start to ask the question. And dovetailing, that was this guy that I talked to on my own radio show, and he had his book out about, it was called Judas of Nazareth. He said the closest historical character you can find to Jesus was a man named Judas of Nazareth. And because there were several candidates, and he believes that Jesus was an amalgamation. And the problem that does, what does that do to Christianity and Christians' faith if they find out Jesus wasn't a real guy?
Right.
Because he was a composite? And maybe all of mankind really is just it's just all about anthropology. And I don't want to dissuade anybody from their faith by any means, but these are the things that you start to look at some of this stuff and you get a really different picture of what the Bible is about and of what happened. And this whole question you asked about the Pharaonic and all of this and into the great houses of Egypt, we start to see how some of this works. We start to see how even Christianity itself may be something different than what we were taught. And so we have to be very careful with what we look at. And of course, even with new theories like this, or when you're getting into fringe theory like this, you have to be really careful. Because what if you're wrong? And
you're going to upset a lot of people, believe me. It's funny.
You stand before God and he goes, hey, this thing you were talking about?
I'm that guy and you're wrong.
I'm that guy. So,
but even people here on Earth, though, it's funny because I've done a lot of shows dealing with different subjects of UFOs, aliens, conspiracies, extraterrestrial visitation, contacts, biblical stuff. But nothing has gotten me more in trouble, Scott, than when I talk about Jesus and the possibility that he is somebody that is completely different than what the Bible tells you he is. That it's like you said, an amalgamation of all these different characters. And when I've said that in the past, I've gotten hate mail. And that's literally the only time I get hate mail is when I talk about Jesus in a way that is contrary to what the popular belief of what Jesus was.
And you know what my problem is with that? And anybody listening out there that is adherent to your faith, I was in the same faith, and I still I got to say, I haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater. That's why I call myself agnostic. I really don't. I'm not an atheist. I just don't know anymore. And I used to have all the answers. I could have answered all these questions. I was in ministry, for Pete's sake.
Yes.
And now I just don't know anymore. I don't know those answers.
I was raised a Jehovah's Witness. For Christ's
there
sake.
you go. There you go. For Christ's sake. And
pun intended.
Yes. and I grew up surrounded by Jews in my family. So, my mom's stepdad was Jewish, so we were the five goy in an ocean of Judaism in my family. And the thing about talking about any of this stuff, you're always going to have somebody who's offended. And I want to say, don't be offended, but look at it as something that could either strengthen your faith or it could be something that could make you question it. Right. But think. The idea is think. Think for yourself. And don't get pissed off because somebody might say something you don't like. Oh, he's offended my Jesus. And it's like, you know what? How do you know for sure? Ask the questions, do the study. To me, blind faith is blind living.
Right.
I don't want to believe something because somebody told me it's so. I want to believe something because I know it's so. And we're getting in a totally different area.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, we go with a lot of historical stories based on faith alone because there's very little evidence to just about anything.
Right. Well,
that's the sad part of it. Yeah, and then when you think you have some kind of evidence, then it turns out that you're wrong, like the helicopters in Egypt, for example.
Right.
So
and
it's very tough.
Dogmatic about that. You can't be that dogmatic about things. What if you learn that Jesus was a composited character? Mm-hmm. Does that do away then with his divinity? The divinity of Christ is done away with, or just something as simple as I was just reading something that somebody had written about me. I just happened to come across it because I was looking for something else. And somebody was taking me to task because how dare I even suggest that the Lord and Savior could have been married? And because in my book on the Nephilim, I actually mentioned the marriage of Jesus.
Mary Magdalene,
believe me, it fit in context where I wrote it. Yeah, I believe that he was married. Was it Mary Magdalene?
I'll go a step further. I think he had kids.
I think he probably did too. Yeah. There's a couple of things to look at, and folks, just consider this, and this is what I was being taken to task for. And consider what you believe. If you're a believer in Jesus, that's great. Continue believing in Jesus. But consider some of the things about him. I had my former seminary buddies tell me because I said this, that was blasphemy. I said, why is it blasphemy for Jesus to have been married? I said, where does it say that the Messiah couldn't have a wife?
Right.
It didn't say that anywhere, but it does say this. There was a first century Judean culture which still exists in Judaism today, and that is that a rabbi must be married. It wasn't law, but it was damn close to law. It was tradition, and a rabbi was considered not worth his salt unless he was a married man. Now, Jesus in the New Testament is many times referred to as rabbi, a teacher.
Right.
And he was a rabbi of the people.
Right.
And when they called him this, there was one qualification that was tradition that he had to do before he was accepted as a rabbi. And what was his first recorded miracle of Jesus' public ministry? It was the changing the water into wine at the wedding at Cana.
Right.
And my contention is that there have been things omitted from the story. That this was actually his wedding. And there's several things that point to it. Number one, another tradition from first century Judea and past and even present today is that at a wedding, the groom and his family are responsible for the wine. And here you've got Jesus. He's sitting at the wedding. You can see him talking with his friends. His mom comes to him, Mary. She's got a position of authority at this wedding. But she comes to not the groom, who's responsible for the wine, the way you would read the story, but she comes to Jesus and says, No pun intended. Oh my God, we're out of wine. And what does Jesus say? He says, "Woman, calm down. I'll take care of it."
What did she say? Oh my Jesus, or oh you?
No. She
right
just
there?
comes. Yeah. What do you say? Jesus Christ.
Oh wait, you're right there.
Yeah.
Hey, you come here. We need to get more. We need to get more wine. You know, one thing that is law, though, Scott, and it's a terrible, terrible law. We have to end the show in a couple of minutes, and we have to wrap up. That is the worst kind of law. But if we don't, Keith Rowland will completely get mad at me. And
I understand.
Don't want that happening. But I want to give you a couple of at least 2 minutes here to give everybody your website information and how to find your books. Which obviously Amazon is the one of the best places to get the books. But give out all your information to the audience.
Sure. Well, let me do a couple of quick little plugs in there too.
Go for it.
We, as you know, John Ward and I, we write together. We do these trips together, and so on. We're working on branding something for a television production that we were approached on, History Trippers, and so we do these trips out there. We're taking a big trip in June of this year under History Trippers and the Grayling Report. So it's John and me, Micah Hanks, Barry Fitzgerald, formerly of Ghost Hunters International, very much a researcher in other realms other than just ghosts, and James Swagger.
That's my boy right there.
There you go. We five are going to be leading a trip to Ireland in June.
Very cool.
And it's June 12th through the 23rd. All you have to do is go to Exodus Reality. It's the name of our book on the Exodus. ExodusReality.com. Don't go to Exodus Realty. You'll actually get to a place that'll try to sell you desert land or something. So ExodusReality.com and click on the Ireland link, and you'll see that and how to get your tickets and so on. It's coming up pretty quick. We'd love to have you come along. We've only got 12 out of 15 seats. We started advertising this about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. We got 12 seats out of 15 open spaces left. We also have the Paradigm Symposium coming up. Go to paradigmsymposium.com. 2015, we've got Randall Carlson. We've got several names you're going to know. I'm not going to use up all the time to name the names. You know them. Go see paradigmsymposium.com. Then our books are just available everywhere. You can go to amazon.com. You can see them on our websites and click on the links and so on. And I also do, with John Ward, we do Intrepid Radio Sunday nights. So I know I'm on another radio network. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
Guys.
It's all good. It's not a time slot that I fill, so it's all good.
There you go. We have fun with it on Sunday nights. So,
Scott, we got to wrap up here, but it's awesome having you on the show, and we want to have you back on. And I hope it doesn't take 3 years to have you back on the show.
Well, I hope not. Anytime, brother. Thanks, Angel.
You're awesome. Guys, this has been Scott Allen Roberts, and I want to thank him deeply for being here for an hour and a half. It's just awesome having him on the show. In fact, we went over an hour, as you guys know, because this is just an amazing guest to have on. For Keith Rowland, for the Dark Matter Radio Network, for the other guy who's not here right now, I am Angel. This is Skywatchers Radio.